We will now be talking about the new Nazi order in Europe and the onset of Operation Barbarossa. Now, from 1914 into 1941, many nations end up under German hegemony, and this was acceptable to much of Western Europe's population at the time. The Germans ruled either through local civilian administrations, usually with Reich commissioners, local officials, or directly through the military. Direct military rule examples include the occupied area of France and Greece, whereas local rule examples would be Norway, the Netherlands, and the Czechs. The Germans also operated a cloud of satellite states, which were essentially just allied states of the Nazi realm. This includes Hungary, Finland, Romania, Bulgaria, and of course, fascist Italy, bound by the Tripartite Pact of Defense, which of course Croatia and Slovakia would later join, also through the Anti Comintern Pact against the Soviets, which included Germany, Japan, and Italy. Now, Vichy France was a strange state. It was governed locally, yet also subordinate to Berlin, and was initially developed under Philippe Pétain, who was, if you remember, a World War I hero for France, who had formed a pro German, ultra conservative state. Now, Denmark is allowed to retain their king and parliament until 1943. Other nations, such as Spain, Portugal, Switzerland, Sweden, and Turkey, are technically neutral, yet technically it also really side with Germany politically and in foreign affairs. Now, a large problem with the internal structure of the Third Reich was the issue of polycracy, whereby state management was marred by internal rivalries between the party, the ministerial bureaucracy, and elements of the SS. Many times we can see that where Hitler actually delegates tasks to various people and pitted them against one another. This usually is a check of loyalty or functionality. Hitler tended to dislike the stiff rule of law types. One great example would be Wilhelm Stuckert of the Interior Ministry, and preferred ideological fanatics, such as Heinrich Himmler, within the Nazi Party itself. This naturally destabilized and decentralized the realm. Around this time, we see the beginning of Germanization, whereby we see closed schools, street names are changed and homogenized. Well, that is, the realm is homogenized by suppressing local cultures and colonization of Germans. We also face in this the assimilation problem, whereby it is pretty difficult to discern who is a German and who's not a German. This leads to the Deutsche Volksliste, which is essentially just a list to classify all groups into the Nazi hierarchy. This is usually done through two means. One would be through incentives for German heritage, whereby, you would essentially be some local governments would pay or give state incentives for people to identify as German. It's less violent and it's very practical. Now, some of the more ideological fanatics within the SS would prefer Nazi race science to classify people. This was usually done with the SS's Race and Settlement Main Office. And there were, of course, around this time, plans to deport Ukrainians, Russians, Poles, Czechs, and other minorities east to the Arctic, with others to be Helat-type slaves. Now, soon enough, the states of the new Nazi order began to experience the terror of the secret police, the Gestapo. Now, back in 1933, with Hitler's Reichstag fire decree, Hitler manages to unite the decentralized police forces and overcome the various Weimar constitutional protections over the Republic. Now, by 1936, the state police was formed, combined with the criminal police, or the Kripo, and eventually merging with the SS intelligence service, which would come to form the Reich Security Main Office, of which the Gestapo was Office 4. Heinrich Müller was put at the head of the vicious police force. No, the Gestapo really could just bypass courts and send dissenters straight to concentration camps under Schutzhaft, or protective custody. The Gestapo then were above court findings and enforced the 1935 Nuremberg laws concerning Jewish suppression. During the wartime period, they investigated and punished various civilian dissenters, participated in mass murder events with the Einsatzgruppen units, policed foreign laborers, and facilitated the deportations and the rounding up of the Jewish peoples and other undesirables. Here we see the various elements of the Reich Security Main Office. At the top, we see SIPO, or the Security Police, making the Gestapo and the Kripo unite together under the Interior Ministry. Here, an element of the Nazi Party SS, we have the SD, or the SS Security Service, and later on, the intelligence element of the Wehrmacht, the Abwehr, would later be merged in 1944. Now, the SD was a subgroup of the SS that gathered intelligence on enemies of the state and Reich. This was led by Reinhard Heydrich. Now, these people targeted political opponents, Jews, Freemasons, and other peoples. Now, the Einsatzgruppen became legendary for their war crimes on the Eastern Front, and was made up of security, police, and SS forces. Now, the Schutzstaffel, or the SS, was Himmler's organization of elite Nazi Party paramilitary and intelligence units. Now, despite having numerous offices, the SS was a very large entity. They were very famous for purging the original Nazi street thugs, the SA, back in the night of the Long Knives. If you remember, these would be the original Nazi thugs that would battle the communists in the streets back in the Weimar period. This group was more professional, and it answers to Himmler and Hitler themselves. Now, they had racial purity screenings early on and lots of occult imagery. The death's head, the runic SS symbols, and the silver daggers are commonly seen on SS paraphernalia. Now, by 1939, the SS is split into two groups: the Allgemeine SS, which controlled the various police forces and the SD, and the Waffen SS, Hitler's personal bodyguards, concentration camp administrators, and they comprised of numerous elite combat troops. The Einsatzgruppen and death squads are under the authority and organization of the SS. Here we see various SS artifacts. We see the runic SS, we see the Death's Head, and we see an SS battalion on the bottom of the screen. Now, for the states that didn't wish to be directly ruled by the German military, many faced collaboration with the Nazi order. One such organization was Vichy France, which was the rightist regime in unoccupied France under leaders Philippe Pétain and Pierre Laval. They really just hated democracy for weakening France and making them lose the Second World War. And much of the policy we see includes Jews being registered with the police, foreign born Jews being arrested, and unions were subdued. In the famous Veldiv roundup, nearly 13,000 Jews were arrested by not the Nazis, but the French police on orders from the Gestapo. These, of course, would be sent to Auschwitz. Birth control was outlawed and marriages became very hard to dissolve. So we see this sort of return, this quasi return to aristocratic and Catholic values, of which France was famous for in the medieval period. German occupation of Vichy in 1942 really starts to kick off serious French resistance movements. Another famous state in this period was the ISC, or the Independent State of Croatia. The fascist group called the Ustasha was defined by their 17 principles, and these people were exiled from Yugoslavia back with their leader, Ante Pavlik. Now, the German capture of Yugoslavia allowed Croatia to break away from the group. And right away, we see horrific ethnic cleansing of Serbians, Gypsies, Jews, and part of this is an old rivalry in the Baltic, in the Balkans. The Croats are Catholics, the Serbs are Orthodox. This is actually a very old split. Now, we see mass murder sprees in this period that shock even the Germans and Italians, and they also formed a concentration camp of their own at Jasenovac. Now, the Nazi occupation would eventually spur resistance in the Reich. The Special Operation Executive in Britain under Winston Churchill had its job to train operatives to return home to foment rebellion in Europe. The old French Prime Minister Charles de Gaulle's Free France movement aids with his Marquis rebels on the continent, who attempted to set up a republic at Wörgl. The Germans unfortunately annihilated them. The SS in this period butchered civilians at Oradour-sur-Glane in retaliation. Czech agents assassinated Heydrich. If we recall, he was the head of the SS Security Service, or the SD, prompting once again massive retaliation against Lidice in Bohemia. The Home Army of Poland was another such rebel group, although they were a bit more cautious than the others, avoiding frivolous engagements that would prompt German execution of civilians. They used sabotage, killing, and intel gathering. The governor of the German Baltic Eastern Zone was blown up in this period. And unfortunately for him, his maid was with the resistance. Well, in the Balkans in this period, we see the communist partisan movement emerging in Yugoslavia, which is starting to form a bloodbath. Now we see Joseph Tito Broz leading the communists in this period. And this was a huge slugging match between the Germans, the Italians, the fascist Ustasha, and a group of Serbian nationalists referred to as the Chetniks. In the wake of World War II, the communists would take over Yugoslavia. And on June 22nd, 1941, the Wehrmacht enact Operation Barbarossa, the long-anticipated invasion of the communist Soviet Union. Now, the invasion had a few goals in mind. The main, of course, was to destroy the final English ally on the continent, and to do it before the US could enter the conflict on the side of the Allies. Not only that, the massive natural resource pools of the Soviet Union would probably alleviate the effects of British naval blockades. Because again, Germany is not a resource-gifted nation, not even at this point. Now, Stalin at this point had decimated the upper echelons of his Red Army over the years, and this was actually evident from the numerous blockades and failures he had faced during the Winter War, in which the Finns were able to inflict 300,000 casualties and force a settlement. Hitler is emboldened by this perceived failure. Now, the German command released various decrees that really upped the brutality on the Eastern Front to the point where there would be atrocities that would not be seen on any other theater in which the Germans fought. One of these was the decree on the exercise of military law, which suspends military courts, freeing soldiers to commit atrocities on the Eastern Front against the perceived subhuman Soviets. The reprisal directive enacted that for every soldier killed, we were to kill 50 to 100 Soviet civilians. So it's more vicious reprisal killings that we see with the Japanese fighting against the Chinese. We also see the very famous Commissar Order, whereby all Soviet commissars were to be immediately executed by the SS. And the Army Chief of Staff, Franz Halder, further elaborated on this and claimed that guerrilla attacks must be met with collective punishment against entire villages and sites. The Wehrmacht also encountered a hunger plan, whereby the Wehrmacht were to live off the land, steal livestock, and seize grain for the German people. The idea here is that the Soviet people will be utterly decimated and will starve to death. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel claimed that human life in the East was absolutely worthless. This is important for remembering the war crime legacy of the German military. It has been a common myth that it was the SS and Gestapo that committed pretty much all the war crimes, whereby the Wehrmacht is largely innocent. This is not true in regards to the Eastern Front. Now, Barbarossa is often referred to as the largest invasion in human history. With a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Seas, it caught Stalin entirely off guard. He refuses to let most of his generals retreat, who, of course, camp in the cities on the frontier, get surrounded by the Blitzkrieg, and get eviscerated in massive encirclement movements. Now, the Germans split their attack into three large wings. Army Group Center, who was to take the railway center at Minsk and eventually try to advance on Moscow during Operation Typhoon. We have Army Group North, who was to take the arms production city of Leningrad. And, of course, Army Group South, which was to take Kiev, and all of these planned to converge on Moscow itself. Now, crossing of the Stalin line expected to doom the Soviets. The Germans, Hitler really viewed the Soviet Union as a rotting house. And when you kicked in the door, the whole thing would come crashing down. This would not come to be. But anyway, Hitler essentially diverts many of his panzer divisions from Army Group Center to Army Group South's assault into the Ukraine. Guderian pleads with Hitler to change his mind. Fails. He fails. This does not work for him. And of course, Army Group Center ends up stalling. Army Group Center does not end up taking Moscow. And this is seen by many as one of the first serious military failures on Hitler's part. Now, the Soviets began to employ scorched earth policies to deprive the Germans of housing, food, roads, and virtually anything useful to their cause, making living off the land impossible. And of course, the horrific autumn rains bogged down the armored division's progress, and many of the commanders begin to get very concerned. The Blitzkrieg relies on speed, so the Germans did not have access to long-term winter supplies or gear. This problem was only compounded by the continually worse Russian infrastructure and roadways as the Germans dug deeper east. The operation to capture Moscow by the Wehrmacht was referred to as Operation Typhoon, and the idea was to take the city before winter could totally wreak havoc on the German forces. The idea was for a pincer movement to sever the Moscow-Leningrad Railway to the north, to the south, and to the west of Moscow itself. Unfortunately for the Germans, the Soviet Siberian troops, which were being used as guard against the Japanese, were brought into the fight, and defense and depth tactics ends up halting the offensive. Now, the Soviet counteroffensive pushes the Wehrmacht back and nearly encircled three German armies. Hitler, not surprisingly, forbids Army Group Center to retreat, who end up taking 800,000 casualties, 300,000 of which were deaths. In the wake of this failure, Hitler ends up removing Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch from supreme command of the German army. Lastly, it is important to note just how brutal fighting on the Eastern Front was. More in particularly, we will be looking at the mass murder implemented by the Wehrmacht and SS elements that followed them. Now, the Soviet Commissar state functionaries that always accompanied the Soviet troops, they were, of course, killed by the Army or SS immediately upon capture. And for the rest of the POWs, we see death marches essentially going west to the Reichskommissariat Ausland occupied zone, where they're just dumped into these large, guarded, barbed wired pits in the ground. 2 million fatalities would result of this. It is considered by some as the largest atrocity in the history of warfare. German General Walter von Rachenau at Kharkov, Ukraine, ends up sealing off the city during a siege to starve it out, and hungry kids were offered bags of excrement to eat it in a mocking manner. Again, the Germans have a very low view of Slavic peoples. Meanwhile, a 900-day siege at Leningrad leads to people inside being forced to eat vermin, tree bark, and pretty much anything they can get their hands on to survive. Also, due to the wide scope of the operation and the brutalities that occurred therein, guerrilla movements naturally spawned. And unfortunately, these guerrilla movements against the Germans spawned brutal retaliation killings. Many of these included village burnings, mass rapes, murders, executions, and the activity ultimately ends with 13 to 20 million Russian people being killed off. One of the most feared groups on the Eastern Front were the Einsatzgruppen, which were essentially SS death squads that followed behind the Wehrmacht and performed ethnic cleansing in the regions that were captured. So the German army would move forward, clear out the Soviet army, and SS elements would follow close behind, carrying out ethnic cleansing. It should be noted that the Wehrmacht provided logistical and supply support to the SS. It is not that the SS is entirely on its own. The Wehrmacht is complicit in the ethnic cleansing.